Hello, this is Edward James Tagg, and I'm a transpersonal therapist. And I've already done a video on how to cope with the deceased parent, but this is part two, primarily because I spoke about a parent who was still alive, but now I'm talking about the after process. If you've had a parent who has recently passed or possibly has been passed a long time. I know, for instance, that I didn't process the death of my mother for a very long time. I can't quite remember if it was about 10 years after. So I want to talk about that process when it's delayed. Okay, or even if a parent has just passed. It's a very, very dramatic emotional time, and sometimes the pain of a funeral or even a number of years, the first couple of years can be very traumatic, very closing down, and can bring about a lack of hope and sometimes even a will to live. So I want to be fully available to people at that level. So quite often, if you get a chance to go to the funeral of your parent, your mother or your father, it can be very dramatic. I know that I missed out on my mother's funeral. I couldn't get a flight in time, and so that was difficult. And that's probably part of the process of letting go of that process being difficult. Okay, so what I want to say most importantly is the way in which we view our parent, or trying to reframe the way you feel about them and the way you look at their life and their impact upon you. So I want to talk a tiny bit about the death process. I don't know how many people have already had this experience, but sometimes you might imagine or feel that out of the corner of your eye you might be in the kitchen and peeling potatoes, and then you see a flicker and you look and you say, oh, there was nothing there. So some people have a feeling that for 2 or 3 days or around the funeral time that their parent is actually watching, or still watching them, worrying about them, whether or not they'll be okay. And some people can have a belief about the afterlife and be okay with that, and some people can be a bit nervous about that. So I personally do believe in an afterlife, and I have spoken to a lot of people who have had these types of experiences. So my understanding is that when they do pass over, apparently they go through the halls of healing, and whatever processes they had in their living experience, they have an opportunity to heal all of that and to let go of that pain. So what's very, very important to understand is that any anger or bitterness or non-forgiveness you have going on about them when they're alive, it's very important to be aware that when they're on the other side, they're cleansed of all of that. So if you go to a psychic clairvoyant medium, you might be very surprised because your parents could be trying very, very hard to either say that they're sorry or they want to be forgived. And quite often they'll bring through the happiest memories, and you'll say, well, I can't remember those childhood memories, because if your life was full of resentment, you might not be able to reframe it and look at your parents in that way. But it's very, very important that you do if you're able to. And I talked last time about the difference between intellectual forgiveness and visceral or bodily forgiveness, where you've got to release pain stored in your energy centers of your body, like your solar plexus, to really move forward in a competent and healthy manner. So sometimes there can be sibling rivalry and difficulties surrounding the will, and that can be a process that makes that pain double or even tenfold, and it can be very difficult. So the other thing that's really, really important is to look for disguised forms of stuckness in your life. So if you never cried at the funeral or even after, or went to a grief counsellor, you could have some stuckness and some avoidance or even judgments and anger in that process. And so it's important to look at those disguised processes. So it can come forwards in forms of judgment towards others or inability to move forward in your life. So it's very important to find strategies in looking at stuckness. And then when you make the correct attribution and realize that possibly you haven't forgiven a parent even after they've passed, that can be a very, very important goal or task to work on that. And you need to be very, very kind and gentle with yourself, because that's a very painful process, and that stuckness can be a very frightening place to be in, and it can go on for quite a long time. And if you're in your 40s and 50s or around that time, there could be a midlife crisis or an unwillingness to move forward. I've even met really high-level businessmen who have a situation where they hit a brick wall, and all their investments, and even if they've been famous in banking or stockbroking or investments or even corporate CEO, they don't understand why they go through this midlife crisis and why they'll hit a brick wall and nothing's working for them anymore, and they'll try many different strategies. So I also work as a business advisor and help work around that grief and that emotional process in a therapeutic environment and strategy to help people get over that difficult bridge. So once you've looked at those disguised forms of avoidance or stuckness in your life, sometimes it can be really beneficial to make a reassessment of how you view your parents, and you can go into information gathering. So I said in the last video that I was very lucky because my father and we'd lost contact with our grandfather, and I very, very recently found his grave. So sometimes getting more information about their life story can be really helpful from other family members. And if you do that, some of your judgments or the way that you viewed them, you might find is quite narrow. And then when you learn more about their life or their suffering or some of the hurdles they had to overcome, it can enable you to have more compassion and understanding, for your parents. So like I said before, your parents are not born, or they're not given a manual on how to parent, so it's just natural they're going to make mistakes. So it's highly important that you give them that leeway in letting go of any judgments or anger or bitterness around this. And there are processes to do that. So you can have contact with other family members like aunties and other cousins and learn more about their life. And I was very lucky that my mother hand typed out all of her memoirs, and also she ran away from a boarding school because when there was bombing in London, she had nowhere to stay when she was almost sexually abused. So there were a lot of trying times for her, and so the bombing of London was really intense. She once walking to school saw a baby's foot in a little shoe, just a foot on the side of the road. And so some of these things for that generation were really intensified and created certain stigmas and certain patterns in their behavior that we don't have today. So the thing that can really, really help you, if you're in therapy or not, but the thing that I kind of help myself and my clients, is that it is actually possible to have a conversation with your parent in heaven or wherever you believe they are. Now, even if you're an atheist and you don't believe in any afterlife whatsoever, from a pragmatic standpoint, it's really, really beneficial just to try and talk to them. Now, when I first started this, I realized that I had hang-ups because I was putting an emotional block, because I had an unwillingness to believe that I was lovable at that level. But if you can really, really get past these blocks, and also I teach clients integrating your relationship with your inner child is hugely important, and that's a really complex subject which I won't go into. But in the beginning, just try and imagine what your parent was like. Now, my mother, she drank tea, all the time. Cups of tea in the morning. She probably would have had it intravenously if she could. So I had a little ritual where I would imagine her in a pretty little cottage in some other dimension, sitting outside with a cup of tea ready for me. And she always had this beautiful smile on her face and her head would be tilted. And I found that hard to believe because that wasn't her natural demeanor when she was alive. She was some would say a tiny bit narcissistic or self-absorbed, so she didn't have that loving outward expression. But after a while, when I began to accept that possibly she might be healed if she did exist on another plane of existence, I felt a huge amount of love from her, and accepting that willingness really transformed my life hugely. So I want to really try and inspire you that although your life may have been really traumatic, maybe you've had an alcoholic parent or maybe abuse or sexual abuse or what have you, some of these lives that you've had could be really traumatic, but it is possible, if you learn to reframe your attitude about your deceased parent, that it is possible that they might be healed and they might have a huge availability of love. So when you do this on a regular basis, it is sincerely possible to actually have a better relationship with your parent after they passed than before when they were alive. So on a regular basis now, I talk to my mother and she just tilts her head and has a beautiful smile. Sometimes she doesn't say anything. She started to talk to me more now. But if you want me to be really honest with you, even at a pragmatic level, even if you have no beliefs in spirituality whatsoever, just trying to have a conversation with your deceased parent can have a hugely beneficial effect on your life. And I'm not sincerely saying that when my mother responds to me that it's actually her. It may be all generated in my imagination, and I have no scientific valid proof for any of that. But just the relationship with your inner child and integrating love and reframing and seeing them from a new perspective can have a profound, huge effect on your life. So if you're willing to do this, and if you want to talk to me about this, if you want to know more, that's great. But I just want to inspire you that having a relationship with a deceased parent is definitely possible, and it can be a very beautiful and enlightening and healing experience. Okay, so if that helps people, great. See how you feel with this. Play around with some of these ideas, and good luck with that.